Madam President, the Subcommittee on National Security and Foreign Affairs hearing entitled Sexual Assault in the Military Part 3, Context and Causes will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that only the Chairman and Ranking Member of the Subcommittee be allowed to make opening statements. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that members who may not be on this committee, like Ms. Harmon and Ms. Davis, who may show up, and anybody the minority may want to have here, be allowed to participate in this hearing in accordance with committee rules. They'll be allowed to ask questions of the witnesses after all official members of the subcommittee have had their turn first. Without objection, so ordered. And I ask unanimous consent that the hearing record be kept open for 5 business days so that all members of the subcommittee be allowed to submit a written statement for the record. And without objection, that is also ordered. So good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I apologize in advance for what I expect as interruptions with votes on the floor. There's unfortunately no way that the subcommittee can control that, and it seems no matter how hard we try to plan these things without interruption, it doesn't always work that way. So we mean no disrespect. I'm sure the House means no disrespect or whatever. We appreciate your willingness to tolerate that and to provide us with your expertise. Last summer, the subcommittee began its examination of what we perceive as a very serious problem. And we focused on the military sexual assault prevention and response programs. Later this summer, we expect to have a new strategic plan from the Department of Defense's Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office, or SAPRO as they call them, as well as a report from the Defense Task Force on sexual assault in the military services. So in the spirit of constructive oversight and in order to prepare for those forthcoming reports and be able to evaluate them in the proper context, we're taking a step back today to examine the underlying dynamics of this crime itself. Our witnesses that are here today are going to provide us insight into the nature of sexual assault and what factors might contribute to sexual violence within the military. Our goal here is simple. We need to become better informed about the causes of these vicious crimes that have plagued countless men and women in the military and society at large. And unfortunately, rape is one of the most underreported crimes in the United States within both the military and the civilian populations. So consequently, there's been little ability to know for certain if sexual assaults are more prevalent in the military or if they occur at the same rate as in the general population. What we do know is that 2,908 sexual assaults were reported within the military in this last year. And it's estimated by some experts that as many as 60% of sexual assaults go unreported. If that's true, certainly the total is much higher, but even one is too many. While most physical wounds can heal, psychological wounds persist. Each incident has untold consequences that tear the essential fabric of a civilized society. Shattered trust and broken dreams, not to mention the incalculable strains on families, friendships, and careers. Sexual assault in the military presents a unique challenge to our society. It's our unwavering duty to protect the men and women that serve in the United States military. Unlike civilian society, we in government have a much stronger ability to control the environment and the culture in which we place our soldiers. If there are elements of this environment that can be changed to better protect the men and women who serve our country, then it's our duty to make those necessary changes. While progress seems to have been made in the past year toward improving prevention and response program within the armed forces, sexual assault is still a grave concern, and we still have a way to go. This is not solely a woman's issue, nor is it simply an internal military problem. This is a matter of national security, something that all of us as citizens who benefit from the protections that our troops provide have to address. The last thing our sons and daughters should fear when they're putting their lives on the line to defend the country is being attacked by one of their own. If we can better understand the contributing factors that lead to sexual assault, then we'll be better able to create policies and programs to effectively prevent those crimes. And as I said, hopefully the information we get here today will let us better judge those policies that we hear about at the end of the summer and see whether or not they meet that standard. Our goal has to be nothing short of elimination of this pernicious crime within the armed services. So again, I want to conclude by thanking our witnesses for being here today and offering their expertise on the important issue. And I yield now to Mr. Turner for opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your leadership on this issue and for holding this hearing and the number of hearings and inquiries that you have done. This is a very serious and a very sensitive issue that affects our military personnel. I also want to thank Representative Jane Harmon, who has been an incredible leader on this issue nationally. She's helped focus really the troublesome issues of how people are placed at risk, how we can lessen the number of sexual assaults, and what we can do to address this, the victims' rights and sexual assaults when they do occur. I became involved in this issue at the behest of Mary Lauterbach, who is the mother of Marine Lance Corporal Maria Lauterbach. Maria Lauterbach was murdered, and after she had come forward with allegations of sexual assault. This occurred at Camp Lejeune, and there were a number of things that we learned about after the fact that had occurred in the issue of the investigation, and that we tried to address in legislation. And I want to thank Jane Harmon again because of her partnerships in this issue, in that working together we were able to identify some issues that we should change in our laws and things that we should try to advance with the Department of Defense. Last year, as a result of what we learned from Maria Lauterbach's tragic death, we were able to get two changes in the National Defense Authorization Act. One is that a military protective order would become a standing order, because unfortunately in her case, her military protective order was allowed to expire. Secondly, the law was changed to require that military protective orders be given as notice to civilian authorities, because also in her case, when she became missing and the local authorities were contacted, they were unaware that an MPO had been issued and that she was the subject of that MPO. In the 2010 Defense Authorization Act, I worked with Jane Harmon again to try to bring provisions in that bill that would make a difference, and the bill that is on the floor today includes provisions that Jane was advancing that go to the issue of prevention, prosecution, and assistance to victims. There's also another provision that relates to the Maria Lauterbach case, and that is a provision that would require that when a military protective order is issued, that again the individual who's the subject matter of that, the victim, would have an ability to get information. They should be notified of their right to request a base transfer for their protection. In Maria's case, Mary Lauterbach indicated that she was informed by Maria that she had requested a base transfer and that had not been granted. The DOD indicates they do not have a record of her having requested a transfer. This change would require that they provide notice to the subject of an MPO that they do have the ability for a transfer. This is an important issue, and every time we have a hearing, I think we learn something different that allows us to move forward with changes in legislation, changes in rules, to try to go directly to the issue of how do we protect our men and women who are serving, and how do we assist those who have been the subject of sexual assault. Mr. Chairman, I greatly appreciate your undertaking this. This is an important issue, and we have a duty to ensure that our service personnel are protected, and I want to again thank you for this hearing.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Turner, for your work on this issue as well. With that, we're going to now receive testimony from the panel before us today. I'll introduce each of them briefly before the remarks begin. Dr. Veronique Valliere is the owner and director of two outpatient treatment centers, Valliere and Counseling Associates, an outpatient treatment center for mental health, domestic violence and victim issues, and forensic treatment services, an outpatient violent offender treatment program. She has consulted and published on the treatment of sexual offenders and presented on the same at national and local sexual offender conferences. She also contributed to the report of the Defense Task Force on Sexual Harassment and Violence at the Military Service Academies and holds a doctorate in clinical psychology from Rutgers University. Welcome. Dr. Fred Berlin is an associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, where he serves as director for the National Institute for the Study, Prevention, and Treatment of Sexual Trauma. Dr. Berlin is a highly regarded expert on the causes of sexual assault and the treatment of sexual assault offenders. He has participated in a number of federal and state government-sponsored conferences on sexual assault offender treatment and management, and Dr. Berlin holds a MD from Dalhousie University. Dr. Elizabeth Hillman is a professor of law at the University of California Hastings College of Law, where she focuses on United States military law and history and the impact of gender and sexual norms in military culture. A veteran of the United States Air Force, she has previously taught at the Air Force Academy, Yale University, and Rutgers University School of Law in Camden. She has published studies on military sexual violence in a number of academic journals, and Dr. Hillman holds both a PhD and a JD from Yale University. Ms. Helen Benedict is a professor at the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University. She is the author of 5 novels and 5 nonfiction. She has also published a number of articles and essays on the issue of sexual assault in the military, Ms. Benedict holds an MA from the University of California at Berkeley. I want to thank you again for all making yourselves available to us today and sharing your perspectives and your expertise. It's the policy of this committee to swear in the witnesses before they testify, so I would ask if you all to please stand and raise your right hand. Do you all swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. The record will please reflect that all of the witnesses answered in the affirmative. I can share with you that we have a policy of trying to ask folks to just summarize their opening statements. We know you are good enough to provide extensive written remarks, and all of those will be put on the record as a matter of course. With unanimous consent, we do that. So your written remarks are on the record. If you could take about 5 minutes to please just summarize those comments, and that way we can try to get to the members to allow them to ask appropriate questions and perhaps get a little more directed information as well. So, Ms. Valliere, we'll please start with you. We'll be looking forward to your remarks.
Thank you for inviting me today. I was asked to testify on some of the psychology of the sexual offender. My work has been with sexual offenders, and one of the things I wanted to highlight, especially in the context of sexual assault in the military, is helping to explain the pathways of sexual offending. I think we're all familiar with the idea of sexual deviance, like a deviant sexual arousal to prepubescent children, for example. But one of the things I find in my work that's overlooked is an understanding of the character pathway, or what the offender carries in his personality that facilitates or allows sexual assault. And in character pathology, what we find is that there's a prevalence of narcissism, which is arrogant egocentricity, a sense of entitlement, a callousness and lack of regard for the impact of the victim, and an ability to exploit others for one's own gratification. People with this kind of character are throughout our society, but placed in a particular context or environment that both presents certain values that may decrease external barriers to rape, as well as the issues that impact the victim, are very important in understanding this. And one of the examples I think might be relevant is the example of prison, for example. A very antisocial criminal person who goes into prison, who never has a history of sexual assault but becomes a prison rapist, is a good metaphor to understand how systems create or merge or collaborate with a certain type of personality to present and promote the risk of sexual assault. And some of the things that, if somebody becomes a rapist in prison, there are a lot of contextual issues, including issues that impact our beliefs and ideas about the victim that impact that. And when you have a character who has no internal barriers to harming others, they may find that sexual aggression is one way that they achieve sexual gratification, that outside their context they may not. The military is a similar system to a prison, not to equate the people the same, but with the right type of character, that perfect storm helps. And if you have a character that's very narcissistic, very callous towards victims, very willing to use power and exploitation to meet their needs, and you put that character in an environment that's closed, that does its own investigation, that's male-dominated, and that has a hierarchy that puts a high delineation between those in authority and those not in authority, as in prisoners and the officials in the prison, or enlisted and officers. What you find is a system that presents an environment that, with this callous or narcissistic character, adheres to and colludes with the idea of power being more important, a devaluation of the victim, a discreditation of vulnerability, a system that colludes with keeping things from authority, and along with attitudes towards the victim, like an us and them mentality. A person with a character pathology will be and thrive in that environment to engage in aggressive and assaultive behaviors. And if in their repertoire is the need for exploitive self-gratification for whatever reason, they're much more likely to act out on that. And not only that, is we all in our environment have what you have mentioned, Mr. Chairman, a societal issue with victimization, of secrecy, the idea that the victim benefits from reporting, the group mentality to protect the offender, all those things. So in the context of this system, when you have somebody with this character, it's important to recognize that this sexually assaultive behavior is a reflection of that offender's character and is not necessarily reliant on some professional identification of sexual deviance, and that those things come together to collaborate to increase risk for a victim or a vulnerable person in that environment.
Well, thank you very much for those comments. Now I have the disturbing news to tell you all that we've just been signaled down for 8 votes, which could take probably 30 to 40 minutes minimally on that. Are any of you going to have difficulty remaining here to respond after that? I don't want to make your personal lives problematical either. So if you're not, we appreciate your forbearance. Again, we apologize for it. We'll see you back here in a half hour or so and proceed from that point, hopefully at that point without interruption to the balance of the hearing. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Turner has graciously allowed this to proceed, even though he is not back yet. So with that, Mr. Berlin, I want to thank you again for your forbearance and patience. I noticed that you've been married for 39 years and the father of 4, so I assume that you have plenty of patience, and that I appreciate it. Thank you.
That's fine. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, first of all. And rather than simply summarize what I've put down that you can read, let me just make a couple of brief statements, perhaps just 3. The first will sound simple, but nonetheless I think is important, and that is to emphasize that any approach to dealing with issues of sexual abuse must be comprehensive. We wouldn't dream of trying to solve the multiple problems associated with alcoholism simply by getting tougher on drunk drivers or maybe putting them on some kind of a registry, and yet society's approach to this problem, in my judgment, at least in recent years, has emphasized correctly criminal justice approach, but very little about education, about prevention, about the kinds of things that I feel are important. To really address this issue, we have to look at problems that are intrinsic in a system. For example, are there factors in a system that deter either victims and or offenders from coming forward and identifying themselves and getting help? We have to identify vulnerable individuals and try to be of assistance to them. There are many people who are struggling to integrate their sexual needs into an otherwise productive and responsible lifestyle, and yet often those people go unidentified and we don't see them until it's too late. The second point I want to make, and it's probably the most difficult one, particularly from the political point of view, is that I believe if we're really going to solve this problem, we have to stop looking at this dichotomy that suggests that one's either concerned for victims or concerned for offenders. I would argue that the best favor that one can do a prospective victim is to keep he or she from becoming victimized in the first place, and we can only do that by learning more about those factors that predispose individuals to become offenders. I think we have made it difficult for offenders who want to get help before the fact to step forward. I can give an example, actually, of a gentleman who, in his final year at a military academy within the past few years, was court-martialed and had to leave because he had begun to download child pornography. This was a man who knew that he had a problem. He desperately had wanted help, but he was extremely afraid to raise his hand and identify himself because of what it would likely have done to his military career. He knew that if he sought help, that might be reported to the commanders, and I do understand that what's best for the military has to come first, but it deterred him from seeking help. And he had to hear names like pervert and predator attached to him, and I can assure you that that's not particularly helpful. This was a very serious problem, and yet, it's hard for anyone with any psychiatric issue to raise their hand and ask for help. It can sometimes be particularly difficult in a military setting where people learn that they need to be tough and deal with issues, and it'd be particularly difficult for people that are struggling to try to integrate their sexual needs into a proper lifestyle. The final point I'll make, and I'll make it because we're in a legislative body, is that in my judgment, so much of what's been done legislatively in recent years has been based on the exception rather than the rule. In other words, we hear about some absolutely horrible crime. A child is kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered, and understandably there's tremendous emotion, a sense that we need to do something, and we try to proceed to take action. And the example I'm giving, however, which is an example of sexual abuse, that kind of situation represents a fraction of 1% of the overall problem. And so it begs the question in my mind that do we have the most effective public policies when public policy begins to be driven by the exception rather than the rule? There are many people who engage in sexually abusive acts, and I can tell you this from years of experience, who do want help, who will accept if it's offered to them. And the recidivism rate, contrary to what tends to be out there in the public consciousness, is by no means as high as people tend to think it is. In fact, I mentioned in my written testimony that a study published by the Office of Justice Programs that looked at the sex offender recidivism rate as a group found it to be lower than the recidivism rate for people who commit other kinds of serious offenses, and yet almost all of the current public perception and public policy is based on exactly the opposite assumption. So again, I thank you for letting me come here today. I realize that some of my remarks are a little bit against the grain of what you may sometimes think. I assure you that I'm very concerned about protecting victims. I know every single decent human being is, but until we stop demonizing all offenders, polarizing, acting as though all of them are less than human, they don't have families, they don't have people that care about them, in my judgment at least, it moves us backwards and not forwards.
Thank you very much, Mr. Berlin. Ms. Hillman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I'd like to talk a little bit about military law, which I think is part of the problem as well as part of the answer to the grim and important and vexing issue of sexual violence in the armed forces. I want to suggest that war is not the primary context in which American military law has been made, but rape is the primary context in which it's been made. And that has some consequences for understanding how much criminal justice can be part of the solution here and how much military criminal justice will not solve this problem for us. The first point I'd like to make is that the effort that the armed forces and the U.S. government has put into solving this subset of military sexual violence, that is, violence directed against service members by other service members, which is really a small part of what the larger issue is. But the resources we have put into that are extraordinary, I think. They're evidenced by the work that this committee has done. They're evidenced by work across the armed forces, the different branches of service, commanding officers who have spoken out against this, and many different programs that have been initiated in the military. It's also evident in the doctrines of the military courts. Contrary to what casual observers might think, military rape law is not backward and behind the times. In fact, the doctrine of constructive force, the idea that the force required to perpetrate a sexual assault could be not physical necessarily, but could be coercive. That came about in military courts in the 1950s. Likewise, the statute that governs the sexual assault in the military has been significantly revised. Just a year ago, we have a much more complex, perhaps unmanageable article to prosecute military sexual assault now compared to what we had in the past. Yet, these changes have not solved the problem. Nor have the efforts to train and to educate service members solved the problem. I think part of the problem is that the culture of the military is linked to that law, and part of that culture and that law makes rape and sexual violence a norm in military circles, a part of authentic soldiering rather than not a part of soldiering. I think that many military legal precedents, because they are grounded in sexual assaults and in domestic violence, they create an assumption that women are vulnerable. They create an assumption that sexual stereotypes, that racial stereotypes are the norm, and that persons act on those in the arena of sexual interaction and assault and coercion, and that this has a tremendous impact. I'd like to suggest then that no matter how many servicewomen we have in positions of authority, no matter how much rhetoric we subject men and women who are in our armed forces about the necessity of ending this problem, that we need to break that link between sexual violence and war, between soldiering and rape. And I think one of the ways that we can consider doing that is by prosecuting at least some sexual assault in civilian rather than military courts. I don't think the court-martial is necessarily the right place for these sorts of prosecutions to happen. Now, the objection to that is a valid one, and that's the objection that it's important for a commanding officer to protect all of his or her troops, including those troops who are victims of sexual violence, those who are survivors, those who are perpetrators, to get them the help that they need to stop this from continuing to happen and to protect the civilian population as well as the other service members from those persons. That's a fundamental function of command. But we're already breaking that in some ways by the changes that we've made, by allowing restricted reporting by service members who have been assaulted, by not having commanders get full knowledge of the accusations against individuals in the military who are accused of perpetrating sexual assaults. This is not to demonize those folks. This is just to say that one way we could consider trying to break that link between war and rape, between what seems like a transhistorical and in some ways hopeless problem to solve, is by taking the prosecution away from military courts, by making rape and sexual assault get prosecuted in civil courts. As the majority of the rape that takes place in the military is not specifically military in nature. It's not a crime of war. It's an acquaintance rape. It's a rape among young people who have abused alcohol, for instance. It's many different types of sexual assault take place, but certainly a significant part of it is in that realm. There's no reason that you need a specifically military court to adjudicate those sorts of questions and to reach a decision about the guilt or innocence of a person accused in that sort of case. That's but one part of what might be a solution, and a part of how the law that governs this area of human interaction and military interaction is a part of the problem too. Thank you.
Thank you. That was interesting. Professor Benedict.
Thank you. I'm very honored to have been invited here today. In researching my book, The Lonely Soldier, The Private War of Women Serving in Iraq, I spent the last 3 years interviewing over 40 military women who've served in Iraq and Afghanistan, along with some men. And I've also been examining veteran studies and surveys about sexual assault and military culture. I found that many women are being prevented from serving their country as they wish by systematic sexual abuse in the military. Soldiers commit sexual assault because of a confluence of several things, some of which have been mentioned here: military and civilian cultures, individual psychology, and the nature of war, particularly of the war in Iraq. But given my time limit today, I'll concentrate on military culture. The American military has historically been a masculine organization deeply suspicious of women, and this has been slow to change. As a sergeant recently put it to me, in the army, if you show any sign that you are a woman, you are automatically ridiculed and treated as inferior. Military language reveals this attitude to women only too often. Drill instructors denigrate recruits by calling them girls, ladies, and more vulgar terms for women. The everyday speech of soldiers is riddled with sexual insults, and military men still sing the misogynist rhymes that have been around for decades. See the written testimony I submitted here for an example of a Marine basic training song that's so violent I can't speak the words aloud. Many women soldiers have told me that they feel that the view of women as inferior is upheld by the Pentagon itself. As long as women remain banned from ground combat, the message is sent from the top that women are second-class soldiers who will never earn the full respect of their comrades. This is extremely important when you think about sexual assault, because whatever the motivation of any individual rapist is, a profound resentment of or lack of respect for women is part of it. Women are not only seen very often as inferior in the military, however, but as sexual prey. An army specialist who served in Iraq for 11 months said to me, "One guy told me he thinks the military sends women over to give the guys eye candy to keep them sane. He told me in Vietnam they had prostitutes, but they don't have those in Iraq, so they have women soldiers instead." Common within the military is another set of age-old assumptions that acts against women who are trying to find justice for rapes, that women invite rape, report sexual assaults, are liars intent on ruining a man's career, and that men must be protected from such accusations at all costs. Thus, a woman who tries to report an assault often finds herself up against a solid wall of male camaraderie determined to silence her. Some women are silenced by counter-charges, some are physically threatened, some are punished on other charges to undermine their credibility. Some are intimidated by the common view of her as weak and a traitor if she reports an assault. These are some of the reasons why, according to the Defense Department's most recent report, some 80 to 90% of military sexual assaults are never reported. The suspicion of women is also revealed in the military's abysmal record when it comes to arresting, prosecuting, and punishing its rapists. In 2008, a mere 10.9% of all reported assaults went to court-martial, and among those men found guilty, 62% were given punishment so mild they amounted to a mere slap on the wrist. To even begin to change these attitudes and to fully integrate women so that they can serve their country without fear of being subjected to sexual persecution and discrimination, I suggest these 8 reforms. End the Pentagon ban against women in combat, which is paradoxical and archaic. Women are in combat in Iraq, and promote more military women. Educate all officers and enlistees to understand that rape is an international war crime. Expel all men who are found guilty of attacking military or civilian in any way from the military forever. Increase the severity of punishment for violence against women to be more in line with those in the civilian judicial system. Ban the use of sexist language by drill instructors. Educate all officers to take as much pride in protecting their soldiers from harm at one another's hands as from the enemy. Train counselors to help male and female soldiers not only with war trauma but childhood and sexual assault. And last but not least, we have to rescind the don't ask, don't tell policy, which codifies discrimination and is used disproportionately against women to drum them out of the military. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the testimony of all of our witnesses, and thank you for sharing it with us. I'm going to yield time initially on the questioning to Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon has, as Mr. Turner mentioned, been in the forefront of this issue for considerably longer than most members of Congress and many others, and has really been a champion of trying to make sure that we address this in a responsible way and stay on it until it is effectively and fully addressed. So, Ms. Harmon, we recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is this working?
It will be if you just pull it down just a little bit, Jane.
It will be.
Thank you.
I don't know if it gets low enough. Yes. Well, thank you, and thank you, Mr. Turner, for focusing the attention of the Oversight Committee on these issues. A few minutes ago on the House floor, we did pass the DOD authorization bill. That's the reason we inconvenienced all of our witnesses. And that bill, as Mr. Turner said, contains some very useful language that he and I co-authored to try to push DOD and the military services to do more about investigations, prosecutions, and protection of those who come forward. Mr. Turner gave me a shout-out a few minutes ago about the role that I played. I just want to return the favor. The Lauterbach family, whose daughter and her unborn fetus were brutally murdered, lives in his district, and they are very well served by his advocacy. And to you, Mr. Chairman, yeah, I've been around here a long time, and these are issues that move me personally. I see them as both a force protection and a moral issue to protect those who put their lives on the line for our country. But you've been there too, and we've met incredibly impressive women in our intelligence services and our military services all over the world. They have the capability and, in most cases, the platform to serve with great distinction. And it infuriates me that those who step up can be compromised. And I really appreciate the testimony of all the witnesses about this. Dr. Hellman, your testimony intrigued me particularly because you basically said, let's bail on the military court system. We can't find folks who will provide the justice we need. We have to go outside to the civilian sector, which we know does a much better job of this problem. Let me set the context. I have talked about this issue personally because I'm so passionate about it to our current Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, to our current Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen, to our immediate past Secretary of the Army, Pete Guerin. All of these folks you wouldn't automatically think would share this passion, but they all seem to. In the case of Secretary Guerin, he got so passionate about this that he personally pushed for a 5-year campaign in the Army called the I Am Strong campaign, which had been initiated. I was there on day one. The goal of which is to eliminate all rape and sexual assault in the Army, a 1 million-person group, in 5 years. And he figured out that he had to go outside to get investigators and prosecutors, and he did that to help train Army folks to do this right. And I'm not sure how far along his efforts are, but I'm going to urge our colleague John McHugh, who will succeed him, to take up the cudgel here, take up the banner. And so, given that, and given the fact that Mullen has said to me, keep the pressure on, and that Gates was infuriated when the head of SAPRO, which is the office at DOD, charged with at least doing some things with respect to victims, was prevented from testifying by her senior officer. Given their statements and I believe their beliefs, should we give up on the military now, or do you think we could change the culture? And let me just add to this endless question one more thing, and that is that Pete Guerin told me that he sees this as a challenge similar to racial integration of the services 65 years ago or so. It is the major cultural challenge of our age, and the Army and the military have to take it head on. So, given all that, want to reconsider?
Thank you for the opportunity to respond. I wouldn't give up on the military. I've not given up on the military or on military lawyers or on military judges, but I think they need help on this issue now. And I think that civilians could do a better job. And I actually think the parallel to racial integration is a powerful one. And I remember when I was in the Air Force, I was nominated for Company Grade Officer of the Year. I went before a senior board, and they asked me what the most important challenge was facing the military in the future. And I said, handling the integration of women. And I was 22, and I knew a lot more than I do now. At least I thought I did then. Anyway, I agree that it's a huge problem. I will say that the racial challenges of prosecuting sexual assault remain in the military. Capital defendants in the military are predominantly African American. Those on death row are predominantly African American, and the high-profile sexual assaults are predominantly prosecuted, have been, against African Americans. It is not a place in which racial equality has resonated across military justice.
My time has expired, but I think it's a challenge that military leaders are taking on, and I think there are ways to do much better. This is a bright spot for I think, in a couple of committees in this Congress, one of which is this one. And I just want to conclude my testimony by thanking you both for the attention you're paying to this and will pay to it if you are prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice for your country. Your country has to be fighting for you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ms. Hammond. Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to recognize Ms. Davis, who's joined us, who's the head of the Personnel Subcommittee on Armed Services. Ms. Davis incorporated in her mark many of the provisions that Jane Harmon and I had worked on, and I want to thank her for that. That's the bill that was passing today that Jane and I were talking about earlier, that included provisions that hopefully will make a difference. One of the things that I find really an opportunity in this topic is that although each case or circumstances may be unique, of how it's handled comes up to the issue of culture, rules, and regulations, and gives us a picture at times of things that we need to change. With the Lauterbach case, we were very surprised to find that the military protective order that had been issued had been allowed to lapse solely out of neglect, which led us to, well, these should never lapse. Then it led us to that the locals did not know that a military protection order had been issued, and so when she came up missing and the police were called, they had no information whatsoever that there was someone else that they needed to check with who might have put her at risk. And the issue today that we have of the ability of someone who's the subject matter of a military protective order to transfer, where some of the people who are involved in the military protective order don't even have the appropriate information or the channels as to how do I transfer. It's so different in the military setting because we have custodial care of the individuals that are involved. If someone deems that their work environment is unsafe and they're not in the military, they can quit their job, they can move out of town, they have the freedom of movement, something that you lose once you've committed yourself to the military. And so a lot of the things that we learn relate back to how do we change the rules and regulations to ensure protection and safety prosecution. But in looking at these, we still come back to the issue of culture, and I'm going to ask you each to speak about that for a moment, because the thing that is stunning to me is that it appears, even when you don't have a tragedy as in the Lauterbach case where Maria came forward, made allegations of rape, and then ultimately was murdered, that even if a woman does not have a safety issue, even if she comes forward and makes the allegation of rape, and ultimately her life is not as risk as Maria's was, there's still a tremendous career price to be paid. Frequently, if a woman comes forward, it's not merely that she's had the tragedy of the sexual assault that has occurred, but then there is the issue of how in the military it affects her career. And that's, again, something that you don't have in the private sector. In addition to freedom of movement, a woman in the private sector who is a victim of sexual assault, no one is ever going to say, well, you're not going to be as good of a lawyer, you're not going to be able to pursue your career with vehemence, and her ability to continue to pursue her career is unimpacted. I wondered if you'd talk for a moment about the issue of culture and any of the issues that you might be familiar with rules and regulations, because those are the ones that we can impact. But I think the cultural issue is really important. How do we address this culture, not just for prevention, which is incredibly important and we need to address, but when a sexual assault claim has been made, that individual is up against a culture that is either not necessarily supportive of their coming forward, but is also subject to a culture that I think they could be paying a price in their career. I'd like your thoughts on that. Dr. Valerie? Dr. Berlin? Whoever would like to speak first.
Well, I wanted to say that you're absolutely right, but this particular military culture completely magnifies everything that women or any victim, and I will include male victims of sexual assault, because as there's no room for female victims of sexual assault in the military, there's even less room for male victims of sexual assault. But this culture, it incredibly magnifies what we find. As I said, it's a closed system. There's a return to the assault environment. There's reliance on that particular community, whereas a woman not only do they have freedom of movement in the outside world, they have freedom to change support systems, which they do not in a military. The other thing is there's an increased perception of benefits for false allegation in the military that I've noticed, and there's an exacerbation of the idea that all of these are non-stranger rapes, which are very hard to prosecute generally, but extra hard to prosecute in the military as well.
I would like to add, I think that on the level of the enlisted, where camaraderie and group loyalty is paramount. You're not going to be able to change the conception that anybody who tattles on anybody else about anything is somehow a traitor. But I think it can come from the command, and I've seen studies of this, and I've also heard many troops testify to this to me, that when a commander of a given company or even of a platoon or even down to a squad has the attitude that the way he or she keeps his platoon looking good and his career looking good is by following injustice and prosecuting and doing the proper things to protect his or her troops, it can make a huge difference to how much sexual assault actually happens and to how the troops treat each other every day. But if the command is one of those who prefers to keep his reputation squeaky clean by covering up any kind of wrongdoing and turning a blind eye, then the opposite happens. This is a choice that commanders have, which kind of commander to be. And I think we can address that through education in the academies and through education of the non-commissioned officers as well.
Mr. Turner, I think it's a great point about what to do with those persons who are able to come forward and try to prosecute and initiate investigations of sexual assaults. What happens to them afterwards? I think it's possible, though, to integrate their experiences into the broader military culture. And here's why I think that's so. War is about survival in many ways. We want our soldiers to be able to handle things that are difficult and come through on the other side. What could be more difficult than surviving this sort of trauma, standing up before it, letting everybody know that it happened, and then working to resolve that. And I actually think a part of this is connected to our larger issues about mental health for service members and for veterans, and that we need to recognize that those persons who experience trauma can, and in fact often do, survive and are resilient and come back more powerful. And that's a cultural part of the armed forces and of our military culture that commanding officers need to not only do the right thing in terms of prosecuting and establishing the culture, but integrate stories of surviving incidents like this and standing up to prosecute them into the larger training environments of military life.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Turner. Ms. Davis, I want to first congratulate you on the work that you did on this bill, particularly with regard to this issue, and your work that you've had on an ongoing basis in the entire matter on that, and give you an opportunity to question the witnesses.
Thank you very much. Is that on? Are they on now?
Yeah.
Is that, okay, good.
Some of them don't shut off. Others we can't get on.
Thank you so much, and I'm very sorry I wasn't able to be here for your testimony. I had a chance to look over a few of your statements, however, and so I wanted to have a chance to ask you a few questions about that. And I just appreciate the fact that you're talking about resilience here as well, and I think that what we're seeing in the military is that there are some families and there are some men and women who are able to take out of their experiences something that makes them stronger, whereas others, as we know, and we would assume with the kind of adjustment problems that they have returning, that there would be some major troubles ahead. Trying to figure out how do you mitigate that for folks, and how do you really support the resiliency? And it's a difficult question whether we're dealing with sexual abuse and trauma or not, and that's something that really has to be dealt with. I was also interested, and I think that this is probably to Professor Benedict, and you mentioned what can we do? How can we help with this? And I think talking about the culture. One of the things that we heard at a hearing, and this is pretty commonsensical, I think, is that in some ways in the military you have what's considered a toxic mix of sorts. You have a lot of very risk-prone individuals who go into the services. We know people who 20% of the population essentially is fit for the fit physically, mentally, and goes into the services. And of that group, a large number of people, as kids, they were more ready to jump out of trees and take risks than other folks might be. So you have some of that. You also have the possibility that more women, according to some of the statistics, have had prior sexual trauma in their lives who go into the military. I don't know whether that's something that you've all found in your research or not, but, if that's the case, then there are some possibilities there that might not be in other groups of individuals. And I wondered if you could comment on that, to some of your issues that you raised, I think, partly about, the language that's used in training. That certainly plays a role. Is it an overwhelming role? Does it change people, or people who are more apt to see women in that light? It's only confirming for them, but maybe not necessarily life-changing for them. I wanted to have you talk a little bit about banning the sexist language of drill instructors, that issue, and also then just the penalties inherent in that. And one or two other quick questions. You just touched on it a little bit. How do we, within the services, use the ability to work well with the troops in this area as a career enhancement merit? And I don't know that you can necessarily say that if you haven't had to deal with this in your command, that therefore you're glossing over it or you're avoiding it. But on the other hand, we ought to do something in the career path and in rewarding people who deal well with it. It ought to be just like a whole lot of other criteria that are used in terms of how you really evaluate the command. We have raised that on a number of occasions with the military, and they basically say that, it's really part of what we look at. But there may be something special that you've encountered that you could suggest, a better way of actually assessing the extent to which those in command are doing okay with this, are actually educating their troops at the same time.
Thank you very much for all the questions, and for bringing to mind several things that I wished I'd had a chance to say that I can now. About the statistics, there were two really important studies, one done in the Army and one done in the Marines, that showed that about half of the men who enlist were physically abused as children, and half the women were sexually abused, and many were both. So we do have a large population of the military who enlisted to escape violent homes. And therefore they're coming into the military with problems, which is why I mentioned very briefly that we need counselors within the military, on the ground, in Iraq with them, not only the combat stress counselors we already have in place, but people who are trained to deal with childhood sexual trauma as well as whatever happens in the military to people, to help them. This goes to Dr. Berlin's point, to help them before they start acting out, because there have been studies that have shown abused men often turn into abusive men. Not always, but often. So that's one way we could acknowledge that that's an issue in the military, and we could try and address it and stop it before it starts to become part of the problem. The language, we do have a precedent. I mean, drill instructors are already banned from using racist words and from cursing. So we've already done that. So I think it should be accepted to be able to say you can no longer call women, you can no longer call recruits by these denigrating words for women. And in fact, it doesn't make any sense to put down recruits by calling them ladies when some of them are ladies. So it's archaic and it needs to go. The last thing, I know I'm not going in order here, but, civilian culture. Part of training in boot camp, basic training, a great deal of it is about dismantling the civilian inside a recruit and building up a soldier instead. Part of that, some of the things that are dismantled, I think, are rather precious, and it's too bad. But part of civilian training that many of that we all get is a derogatory attitude towards women. So perhaps as part of breaking down the civilian and building up the soldier could be breaking down disrespect for women and building up respect instead, seeing women as comrades instead of as sexual prey. And finally, it had occurred to me as I was speaking before that this idea of rewarding commanders who do follow up justice for the victims in in their command would be a splendid way to go about it, to acknowledge that they've done the right thing, not just to punish those who intimidate, which I think should be done too. I think there should be consequences for commanders when women are shut up, but rewarding those who do pursue the case and stand up for those who've been abused in their command. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Davis. Dr. Valliere, let me ask you, you mentioned some of the traits that one might likely find in a perpetrator on that, and others have mentioned that as well. Are we doing enough to try to screen recruits, to identify some of these indicators, and then to try and begin counseling at that stage, or setting up barriers to people that we know are going to be a problem, or can we identify people and identify that they're so likely to have a problem that we ought to do something about it at that stage?
I don't really know what the screening process is, but I do know that when we refer back to culture, there are things in this military culture that actually encourage. When you have an us versus them mentality, you encourage callousness towards victims, especially if they're the enemy. But along with what Professor Benedict says, I think the disregard and the disrespect for women isn't really ultimately a disregard for women, but it appears as a disregard for women because we devalue vulnerability and we condition in this culture to overvalue power, overvalue dominance, and overvalue some of the character traits that, when they're adaptive, they may be successful tools in the military. And so part of when you talk about breaking down the civilian, you're also encouraging this idea that vulnerability equals weakness, and in our society, weakness equals women. And so there's this big attachment. So one of the things there may be in terms of the education, to educate some flexibility in that idea, some idea of honoring vulnerability, and some flexibility. It's the personalities that are so criminal and narcissistic and callous that out of the context where they're useful, they are not flexible. So you have a general callousness and entitlement and arrogance through the unit, as well as in a particular situation where those things might be necessary. Say in a clinical setting with a surgeon, you have to have those characteristics of being confident and not get caught up in the emotion of it. And that's somehow gotten distorted with some of these personalities.
Thank you. Dr. Berlin, you mentioned that you thought that we sometimes legislate the exception as opposed to the rule. Can you help us out with that? Show us, where do you specifically point to on that regard, and what might we do to change that dynamic?
Well, again, I want to make it clear, my area of expertise is simply in the area of sexual disorders and offenders in general, so I'm not as well versed as some of you folks are in the military specifically. But examples have to do with the fact that most of child abuse, for instance, is committed by people who are well known to the child, family, acquaintances, and yet much of the legislation in the general public of reporting, of identifying individuals is centered around the idea that they're somehow going to be unknown to others. I think the broad brush approach that's out there is another example of what I'm talking about. Years ago, when we first started the so-called war on drugs, and I'm talking back in the 70s, people could get a 50-year sentence for an ounce of marijuana because we didn't make distinctions about the various subgroups of people that existed who had difficulties with drugs. We have people now who are identified on registration lists as offenders who have looked at pictures and have never had a contact offense. Now, if there's evidence that this is a predisposer to contact offenses, that's one thing, but if it isn't, we have to keep in mind that when we identify someone on a registry, we identify their family, we identify their children. I don't want to get too much into anecdotes, but I had an example of a man who came in. The teacher was meaning well and reading out the lists of people who had been registered offenders, and everyone turns to this one kid in the class and says, "Is that your father? And by the way, were you the victim?" Something was intended to protect somebody who created all sorts of harm. So just as with drug addiction, alcoholism, and so on, there are huge distinctions, there are huge variabilities, and I think we have to have laws that are going to take that into account and not this sort of throwing everything at everybody as though it's all the same. That's what I meant by what I had said.
Thank you. Dr. Hillman, you mentioned that some of the current regulations that we have regarding this are unmanageable in some respects, or you fear they might be. Will you elucidate on that a little bit?
Article 120, the rape statute in the Uniform Code of Military Justice, has not had much time on the ground for us to get a lot of evidence about it, but it sets out 14 different crimes that used to be prosecuted under the general article of the UCMJ. Article 134 are now specified under Article 120, and we don't have a depth of jurisprudence on how those are going to be worked out, what standards will be applied, what sorts of crimes will end up under that statute. Now, the attempts to codify and to specify are a good thing. A continued modernization of a system that has been modernized since World War II with the UCMJ, but it is part of what Dr. Berlitt is talking about. It sweeps a tremendous amount of stuff into one umbrella. Article 120, the rape, what used to be the rape and carnal knowledge statute, that it's not clear it all comes from the same place, or that the solutions are in especially aggressive prosecution, more attention to deterrence, more attention to eliminating the workplace environment issues that actually Mr. Turner talked about too, that are distinctive to the military. That is, the military is both workplace and home place for many persons, and as that it's not a place that people can opt out of easily, and to sweep all sorts of things, indecent exposure and access to materials and all the pornography offenses that are charged under that particular statute risks eliding the differences between things that are demonstrably different.
Well, thank you. Maybe we have to revisit that. We'll certainly consider that. Mr. Turner, would you like to ask any further questions?
Well, again, I would like to thank each of you for your testimony. A lot of the testimony that we have that concerns the military is anecdotal information. I want to make clear, just for one footnote, that even though we're pursuing this issue of sexual assault in the military, how do we address it? How do we do prevention, prosecution, and safety? How do we address culture, policy, and laws? I wouldn't want anyone hearing this to get the misimpression that anyone believes that there's something inherent to the military that is causing or is our view is not that we're prosecuting the military and raising this issue. We're raising an issue that addresses the issue of men and women who are in the military. When you pick up an issue that as to what has happened to an individual, or you look at culture, we're not here saying that the military is a bad place or that there are bad people there, but there are sometimes, even with good people, bad things that happen when you have a significant population such as in the military. The issues that we had talked about before of custodial possession of the people who are in the military, the close proximity, are things that also exacerbate the issue for things that we need to address in our laws, culture, and the like. I just felt the need to say that because I think sometimes when we talk about this, someone could get the impression that when you pick up an issue that's a bad issue, that you want to figure out how to deal with it, how to address it, and how to resolve it, that you're not using a broad brush to paint an entire institution or people who are serving their country poorly. Now, to my question. I participated in a lot of these, and I have a particular a memo that I want to share with you that I've shared in every hearing that I've participated, and it gets right to the issue of culture. In culture, we have anecdotal stories. It's hard for us to pick up a culture and examine it. We can examine a policy, and we can examine a law, rule, or regulation. But a culture is a hard thing to ascertain. And I'm going to read to you an answer that was sent to me by Lieutenant General Kramlich, U.S. Marine Corps, Director Marine Corps Staff, in a series of responses to questions I asked about the Lauterbach matter. After Maria Lauterbach was murdered, there was a press conference that occurred, and there was a statement that I found troubling that seemed to indicate that the Marine Corps had no notice or no knowledge that she could be at risk, that her safety was a concern, because there had been no violence that she had reported. Well, she reported sexual assault. That's inherently violence. And so that was very troubling to me, and I thought that if I asked a straightforward answer to the Marine Corps, that I would get a straightforward answer that hopefully would give us all a nice cleansing breath with respect to that, the implications of sexual assault's not violent. So I asked this question: doesn't a rape accusation inherently contain an element of force or threat? And this is the answer I got. As defined in Article 120 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, rape is defined as the sexual intercourse by a person executed by force and without the consent of the victim. Then they go on to apply it to the specific facts of this case. And they say in May 2007, when Lauterbach formally made allegations of rape against Lorien, the command was only made aware of 2 reported sexual encounters. One sexual encounter characterized as consensual by Lauterbach, and the other alleged by her to be rape. Lauterbach never alleged any violence or threat of violence in either sexual encounter. Now that just does not make, that to me is an issue of culture. And we even have the citation of the law. This is rape. Threat, force, or threat of force of rape. And then we have facts that are applied, and then we have policy. And out comes this cultural statement of Lauterbach never alleged any violence or threat of violence in either sexual encounter, one of which in this answer they identified as rape. And I think that gives us a window to culture. And that's why this has been such an important issue for me on the cultural side, because I think we need to drill down to that. I wonder if you would want to comment.
I guess I don't hear any criminalization of the military in what you're saying, but this is, the reality is this is a particular culture. It's a culture that's defined by different boundaries, rules, systems, hierarchy, prosecution, and what personality attracts. In my testimony, I equated it similar to a prison culture, but we could also equate it to a college fraternity culture in which there is certain cultural challenges and certain aspects of that culture that not only attract certain personalities that can be problematic, but separate the victim from certain types of resources that they might otherwise have. So it takes all the stereotypes, myths, everything we have, including the socio-cultural elements of male domination, degradation of women and vulnerability, the group psychology, and it magnifies those and offers us particular challenges in not only the, like I described as the collusion and collaboration of the environment with a certain personality to create an offender, but then a certain collaboration with the offender to protect them from prosecution and to separate the victim from their supports.
I think your example also demonstrates the tremendous need for education. I mean, here's somebody who's equating physical force with violence and doesn't understand that a violent act can occur even absent an actual physical act. And these are things that can be taught. It doesn't mean everyone's going to get it, but if you don't at least make the effort, some people who would have gotten it don't. So I think we are hearing something about culture that is based on a failure to understand and appreciate properly, and the importance of education in that, it seems to me, is obvious.
I think that it's not a demonization of the military to recognize that we put service members in harm's way in a way that subjects them to emotional and mental stress that can have extraordinary consequences. The worst war crime in American history, the My Lai massacre, the mother of one of the perpetrators, not a victim of that crime, the perpetrator, she said they took a good boy and made him a murderer, about her son having been recruited, having been drafted actually, and served in the army. To say that soldiers are made more likely to be rapists is a very challenging thing to say, but there is no doubt that the sorts of totalizing consequences of being asked to do things that we're asking soldiers to do puts them at risk of behavior that they would in fact disown, that we deserve to give them support for recovering from, and that is a real part of understanding this problem in the military.
I would like to add, I sort of addressed this already in my testimony, but that when I was interviewing women who've been serving in Iraq, I didn't go into this looking for stories of sexual assault. I didn't even know that's what I would find, but that's what I heard. When they described their everyday lives to me, I felt as if I was reading about, a fraternity from 1940. The attitudes towards rape are archaic, and your example illustrates that. It can be fixed with education, but there has to be a willingness to hear it. There's still a pervasive idea that women are really good for nothing, but that rape is just sex, and with the woman regretting it afterwards, and many of those other old-fashioned ideas that have been used to dismiss rape as a serious crime and to dismiss women as serious soldiers.
Thank you. Ms. Davis, unless you have any further questions?
Well, perhaps this is a difficult one to ask you right on the spot, but one of the things that we have spoken about is what kind of messages, what kind of education is really helpful. And having watched a few of the videos, I was struck by the fact that I didn't think they were very compelling, and wondered whether the men and women in the field were a part of putting those together, because I think that what they might see, the way they might say it, was different. I was reminded of teen pregnancy messages years ago, of trying to, adults were creating them, and young people were looking at them and saying, that wouldn't make any difference to me at all, but if you tell me I can't go out Saturday night, those kinds of things. And what I'm just wondering is, have you seen any of the videos or the messages that are out there, and do you have a sense of critiquing, or what do you think? I mean, if someone asked you, what would you like to sort of just stay in a kid's head, and recognizing, and I appreciate what Mr. Turner was saying. I don't think any of us here, and certainly my experience has been, this is not to say that the military is doing something which is counter to our values necessarily, but we know that at the same time they are forced to create some values in the services, because they're asking kids to do extraordinary, almost superhuman things. And so it is a different way of managing one's emotions and one's physical prowess and all kinds of other things. But what do you think should be out there? I mean, what is the message in a way that you would like to see the military developing as a foundation for their messages?
One of the things, there are two main components that we see, not only just for the military, but one, we really lack very good education on respectful, healthy sexuality, whether it's in the military or not. And that's even far exaggerated in these subcultures that are male-dominated. So we need to talk about that, how to be together and have sexuality, as well as educate for an intolerance of an exploitation of that. The other thing we need to start educating is not just how not to be a victim, but how not to be an offender. What is consent? What is consensuality? What is exploitation? As well as educating, there's a big movement in the public sector to educate about bystander apathy, basically. How to break that group norm when you're encountering sexual violence, so that there is no collusion within the group to protect the offender, like in a fraternity or something like that.
Well, just brief, I know we're getting late, but I think you touched on this earlier. We need to train people to be able to be violent in a controlled way, but we may also have to train them how not to lose their compassion, the sense that this woman is somebody's sister. This isn't just some object. And so maybe we can do more in the process of instilling what needs to get into a soldier, to be careful to instill, or at least not take away, some of the other human qualities that are so important to be preserved.
I have seen some of the training materials. I think they vary dramatically. Some of them, I think, are very effective, and some trainers are very effective, and others are not. I think the services are capable of sophisticated programs. The recruiting presence of the Army online, for instance, is an extraordinary marketing success, I'd say. So it's clear that it's possible to reach, and I think it's mostly young people who would be the primary audience that we would find receptive and to all these sorts of training. I'd also say that the policy message that we send about consensual sexuality are critical too, and ending the criminalization of consensual sex in the military is a part of this answer too. Ending the don't ask, don't tell policy, ending the criminalization of adultery, absent aggravating factors. Those are critical to changing attitudes towards what really does constitute inappropriate criminal sexual behavior.
I have to go back to my original point about the message from the top. As long as women are still being banned from certain jobs, especially from ground combat, which is the sort of the essence of soldier in most people's eyes, they're still going to be seen as second class. And I think the way to change attitudes in the military is not so much through trying to get men to see women as fellow human beings through abstract ideas. It's to give women the chance to win the respect and to have the power and to have the positions so that they really are equal, so that they are in command, so that they have real authority. And this is happening more, but women are still vastly outnumbered. But that's what works in the military. Everybody has to win respect themselves. And the trouble with the education that we've just been talking about is that there's a danger of condescension in it. There's a danger of looking at women as, well, we have to make allowances for them. And I've never met a single military woman who can stand that. So, excuse me. So promotion and re-examining the Pentagon's ban against women in combat. I think that's essential.
Well, thank you, Ms. Davis. Thank all of you once again. Not only did you give us good and extensive testimony here today that we appreciate, but you have submitted written remarks, and there are volumes of works that you're all responsible for, very credible works that we appreciate and people have access to as well. We all have the list of things that you've reported on this subject. So I believe what you've said today and what you've written will be helpful as we assess whether or not there's reports that come back at the end of the summer really do address in the way that we need to address this important issue. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your patience and for the work that you do. And thank my colleagues. This meeting is adjourned. Thanks. Thank you.